We're so used to looking at the world, well, just through what we can see and touch and experience directly. But what about all the stuff going on behind the scenes, so to speak? The hidden forces and influences that might be shaping our lives without us even realizing it. Kind of like an invisible orchestra, conducting the whole symphony of existence.
And that's exactly the kind of hidden territory we're going to be exploring today, right? And you've brought this amazing collection of material, really dives into this idea of a hidden side to things. We've got everything from, well, like what the word occult actually means, beyond the spooky stuff, to like the possibility of multiple dimensions, planetary influences, even the nature of energy itself. It's amazing how many different ways this idea of hidden sides can manifest.
Totally. And we're not going to get bogged down in all the tiny details here, right? We really want to pull out those big core insights from these sources, those aha moments that shine a light on those unseen influences, hopefully give you a fresh way to see the world without needing a PhD to get it.
Exactly.
So let's kick things off with a word that always seems to pop up when we talk about the unseen.
Right.
Occult.
Yeah.
What does it really mean beyond the the typical associations?
Well, the interesting thing is the word itself, occult, just comes from the Latin occultus, which simply means hidden.
Hidden.
Yeah. So at its root, it's about those things that aren't obvious, not easily perceived, like those deeper currents beneath the surface of, well, everything we normally see and interact with.
Okay, so not necessarily about, like crystal balls and tarot cards and, all that kind of stuff.
Well, yeah, that's definitely a common misconception. These sources you've shared really emphasize that it's not about some secret society hiding knowledge. Instead, it often comes down to our own limitations, our own stage of development, like how well we can perceive, comprehend. As we evolve as a species, our awareness kind of widens. And things that were once hidden, well, they become clearer, almost like a child, right? They gradually grasp more complex ideas as they grow.
Right, like trying to explain, I don't know, like quantum physics to a dog.
Yeah,
You just
exactly.
don't have the mental framework to even grasp it.
Exactly.
Okay, so if occult just means hidden, like what are some of the things, these hidden things that might be influencing us?
Well, one of the sources uses a really powerful analogy to show kind of the limits of our perception. Imagine a tiny little microbe caught in the raging current of Niagara Falls.
Okay, whoa, that's a powerful image. I'm with you. Paint me a picture.
So this microbe, right, is being tossed and turned, totally overwhelmed by just trying to survive in this massive flow.
Right.
Its entire reality is just this chaotic, swirling water. Can't see the riverbanks, no concept of the fall's immensity, where the river's going, the sheer power driving it. Its world is, well, just this immediate chaos.
Oh, so it's so focused on its own little struggle to survive that it's completely blind to the bigger picture.
Yeah, exactly that. And the point is, our own everyday worries, our struggles, they could be doing the same thing to us, blinding us to these much larger forces at play in, well, in the universe, in our own lives.
Yeah.
We're fixated on the little ripples and we miss the whole flow of the river, right?
Right.
Makes you wonder what else we're missing just because of how we see things.
It really does. It really does. And speaking of things we might be missing, one of the sources talks about this idea of multiple dimensions.
Oh, yeah.
That's a big one.
It can really stretch the mind for sure.
Yeah.
We're talking about a multi-dimensional physical world, includes the fourth dimension, and even beyond that. Historically, this idea, well, it got a lot of pushback,
Yeah.
skepticism, people dismissing it. I mean, it sounds like sci-fi.
It's hard to wrap your head around more than 3 spatial dimensions when that's all we really kind of experience day to day.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But according to the source, those additional dimensions, they're real. Even if they're kind of unthinkable for most of us right now at our current stage of, well, mental development. But as we develop what are called astral senses, we start having more direct experiences of these, well, these extensions of reality. For those who are more open intellectually, a gradual understanding starts to emerge.
So it's not that they're not there, it's that we don't have the ability to perceive them yet.
That's the idea. Think of it like learning to see a new color. It exists, but you got to have the eyes for it.
Right, right. So astral senses, that suggests there are ways of perceiving beyond our usual 5 senses. that we might not even be aware of.
Absolutely. And what's really fascinating is the source even mentions that, after we pass away, some people, they actually resist acknowledging these higher realities just because of their deeply held beliefs. It's like they're clinging to the familiar, almost afraid to admit that there's something bigger than what they currently understand.
So our own beliefs can act as kind of a filter, determining what we're even willing to accept as possible.
Yeah, precisely. Our mental boxes, they can keep us confined.
Even when the door to a wider reality
Yeah.
is open. Yeah. So if these higher worlds and dimensions exist, how do we connect with them? How do we bridge that gap?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. The source explains that humans, we actually have matter of these finer grades, right, within us, meaning we're not just physical beings.
Right.
There's more to us. And by consciously shifting our awareness, beyond just the physical brain, we can start to tap into those inner and higher aspects of reality. Like, think of it as having this radio receiver that can tune into different frequencies.
Okay, so it's not like some external magic trick, but about developing our own inner perception.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it's the very existence of these higher realms within and around us that the source says makes occultism possible. It's not just fantasy. It's a study of realities that are simply beyond our everyday perception. And this influence, it's not just somewhere out there. It's permeating our lives all the time, from birth to death and even beyond, especially when we're sleeping and after we, transition from the physical body.
It really expands what we think of as life. It's not just this physical experience.
Right.
Okay, so one of the sources talks about the influence of planets, but it's careful to say it's not just about, like, traditional astrology.
Yeah. It makes a really important point about that. We're not talking about astrological charts and interpretations. We're talking about the actual physical planets, the celestial bodies themselves revolving around our sun.
Okay, so we're talking about Jupiter, Saturn, Mars, Venus, the actual physical planets.
Exactly.
So what kind of influence are they said to have?
Well, the source explains that these planets, they emanate influences, right?
Right.
And these influences have distinct qualities that affect what's called living elemental essence. And this essence, it's both within us and in the environment around us. And this is key. This influence isn't limited to the physical realm. It affects all the worlds,
Okay.
including the astral. Each planet basically has its own unique effect on the many varieties of this elemental essence.
Okay, so each planet is kind of like, it has its own flavor or its own energetic fingerprint that interacts with everything.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about planets, we've talked about dimensions, we've talked about occultism in general. One of the sources digs into the idea of energy itself.
Right.
And it mentions 3, what it calls great forms of divine energy. What are those?
According to this material, the divine sends out, or emanates, 3 primary forms of energy.
Okay.
Electricity, vitality, and serpent fire.
Okay, and just to be clear, we're talking about the divine as in, like, God, a higher power, a universal consciousness.
Yeah, exactly. That ultimate source of everything.
Okay, so electricity, vitality, serpent fire.
Yeah, and while there are definitely countless other forms of energy that we probably don't even know about yet, these 3, they're highlighted as being particularly significant, especially in how they work in the physical world.
So we all know what electricity is,
Yeah.
right? But what about this vitality? How's that different from, say, like light or heat?
That's a good question. The source explains that electricity, light, heat, they all work by kind of making the atom as a whole vibrate, like the large-scale movement. But vitality, it acts on the atom from within, not from some external force. It's more like an intrinsic energy, right?
It's like a life force working at a deeper level within matter.
That's a good way to put it.
And to understand this a little better, the source actually talks about the very nature of the atom itself,
Right.
describing it as a manifestation of divine will.
Yes, and that it's made up of, get this, a huge number of tiny bubbles,
Okay.
like 14,000 million of them. And they're all held together by this constant act of divine will.
So many bubbles, 14,000 million. And they're all, like, depending on this constant act of will to even exist.
That's the idea. The source even goes so far as to say that the physical realm, from this perspective, it's kind of illusory. Like, if that divine will was withdrawn for even a split second, poof, the whole universe would just vanish.
That is a mind-blowing concept. Okay, so where does this vitality globule fit into this picture of atoms and divine will?
Right, so when this unit of vitality is, it's kind of floating around in the atmosphere, it's described as being super bright and almost colorless, like pure white light, but really intense.
Okay.
But the moment it's drawn into this vortex of a force center located at the spleen in the human body, it undergoes a dramatic transformation.
So the spleen, it's not just an organ filtering blood, it's like an energy processing center too.
That's what the source suggests. And as the vitality globule gets pulled into this vortex in the spleen, it breaks down into streams of different colors. And this vortex, it's got 6 spokes, and each spoke acts like a magnet, attracting specific atoms of a certain color. So all the yellow atoms go one way, green another, and so on. And the 7th part, a particularly potent essence, disappears through the center of the vortex, like an axle. And then these colored rays of vitality, they travel through the body, each one doing its own thing to vitalize and sustain us.
So we're talking about colors here, like, are these the same colors that we see in a rainbow?
Wow.
Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet.
That's a really important point. The source says these colors, they don't perfectly match the solar spectrum. Instead, they're more like the colors that you see on, higher levels of reality, like in the causal, mental, and astral bodies.
Oh, okay. So it's a whole other spectrum of color beyond what we normally see.
Exactly.
Okay, so the source also makes this distinction between this constant intake of vitality and then this later awakening of something called serpent fire.
Right. It's crucial not to mix those up. So everyone is constantly drawing in and using vitality. It's a basic life process. But a lot of us, we don't use it as well as we could
Okay.
because of, unhealthy habits.
Okay, right. So if you're living a really unhealthy lifestyle, your body's not going to be able to process this vitality as effectively.
Exactly. Someone who's, eating tons of meat, drinking a lot of alcohol, smoking, they're never going to utilize their vitality as fully as someone who's living a pure, more natural life.
Okay.
So while, karma does play a role in our strength and health, it's like all things being equal, the person living cleaner, they've got a big advantage.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's about creating a clear channel for that vital energy to flow.
Okay. So the source also clarifies this difference between this vitality that comes from outside and what we usually call a person's magnetism.
Right, because the vitality flowing through our nerves, it's not the same as magnetism. This magnetism is more like a nerve fluid that our bodies make internally. And this nerve fluid, it circulates what's called etheric matter along our nerves, kind of like how blood circulates through our veins.
Okay, so this etheric matter, that's what carries the vitality around our system.
Right, just like blood carries oxygen. This etheric current, it's the carrier for that vital energy, delivering it to all our cells.
Okay. And the source even mentions that this etheric matter, it's constantly being exchanged. We're taking it in, we're giving it off. So there's always this subtle exchange of energy happening between people.
Exactly. It's like we're all swimming in this invisible sea of vitality and etheric matter constantly influencing each other.
That's wild to think about. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit from like our internal energy to the external world and how these unseen forces might be playing out in, I don't know, like natural events like storms, earthquakes, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, this is where the occult understanding of nature can get really different from the usual scientific or religious views.
Okay.
So a student of occultism wouldn't necessarily see a storm or a volcano erupting as like evil or random just because it causes destruction.
Right.
They'd see it as part of this bigger cosmic law, this kind of immutable law of justice that's playing out on a grand scale.
So even these destructive events, they serve a purpose.
That's the perspective, yeah. And even when we look at weather in general, right? There's this common feeling that gloomy weather can be depressing, maybe because we're not getting enough sunlight and that vital energy it brings.
Right.
But the source points out that some people actually love those kinds of days.
Yeah, I know people who much prefer a gray, stormy day to a sunny day, so.
Exactly. And one possible explanation is that these weather disturbances, they create a specific energetic sensation that just, it vibes with some people. Maybe it resonates with changes in the Earth's aura, so to speak.
Okay.
The source even talks about thunderstorms, how they can make some people scared while others feel exhilarated.
Right.
Suggests there's something deeper going on than just the physical effects of the weather.
Okay, so our reactions to weather, they might have an energetic or even a spiritual component.
Exactly.
Not just about the physical conditions. What about, like, just the ground beneath our feet? Like rocks, soil, do they have an influence on us?
Absolutely. The source says that everything in nature, including the Earth itself, is constantly radiating influence on us.
Okay.
And different types of rock, soil, they have unique effects for a few reasons. One is the rock's inherent life, which is considered part of the second great outpouring of divine life into the mineral kingdom.
Okay.
Then there's the specific elemental essence that matches the rock on the astral level, representing a later wave of divine life. And then there are the particular nature spirits that are drawn to each type of rock and soil.
Okay, so just the ground we're walking on could be influencing our energy and even our mood.
Yeah, potentially.
Okay, so we've got to circle back to these nature spirits in more detail. But what about the animal kingdom? How do they fit into this web of unseen influence?
Well, the source says that because of, how humans have treated animals, the influence of wild animals on us is pretty minimal now. It's mostly limited to our relationships with domestic animals, our pets.
Okay, yeah.
And in those relationships, yeah, we influence them a lot more because we're more evolved. But their influence on us, it shouldn't be underestimated. That genuine affection from an animal can be really helpful, emotionally strengthening.
It's true, like the bond with a pet. It can be so powerful, so healing.
And while humans are capable of, well, a wider range of love, the source suggests that an animal's love, it's often more concentrated, more wholehearted, like they're putting their whole being into it. It's a really pure kind of love.
Yeah, it's not clouded by all the complications of human relationships and human thought and human emotion. It's very pure and direct. Okay, so let's talk about a more direct form of human influence.
Yeah.
The power of association, the people we hang out with, the people we surround ourselves with.
And this is a big one. You know that saying, a man is known by the company he keeps? It's not just a saying. The source suggests that we're actually made by the company we keep. Our constant associations, they influence us unconsciously. Gradually, our own energy kind of comes into harmony with those around us.
Like energetically, we start to vibrate at the same frequency.
Yeah, exactly. It's like if you listen to a certain musical note over and over, eventually you start to resonate with it.
Okay, yeah.
So if you spend most of your time with people who are, open-minded, generous, focused on higher things, well, it makes it easier to cultivate those qualities in yourself.
Right. You're exposed to that energy, you start to resonate with it.
Exactly. But on the other hand, if you hang out with people who are idle, negative, focused on lower desires, well, it becomes more likely that you'll pick up those same traits. It's like the old saying, evil communications corrupt good manners, but from an occult perspective.
Okay. So we need to be really mindful about the company we keep.
Right.
It's not just about our immediate interactions, it's the long-term impact.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, this makes me wonder about how we see other people.
Mm-hmm.
The source says we shouldn't just think of them as better or worse than us.
Right, there's a more nuanced perspective.
Mm.
Instead of just judging people, the source says we should think of different types of people, like the colors of a rainbow. Each one contributing to the overall beauty, of the spectrum of light, or like different movements in a musical piece.
Okay.
Each one playing a necessary part in the harmony.
Right.
Each person with their own unique traits, they offer specific lessons for other souls.
So it's about seeing the value in everyone, recognizing that everyone have a role to play in this bigger picture.
Exactly.
Okay. And the source even mentions this idea of a spirit of the race, this kind of guiding intelligence behind each race.
Yes. So each race has this powerful being behind it, and it works under the direction of even higher beings called manos.
Okay.
And they're responsible for preserving the qualities of the race, guiding its development, overseeing its destiny. New races appear when evolution needs new sets of characteristics. And then races gradually fade away when all the souls that could benefit from their experiences have moved on.
So this spirit of the race, it actually shapes the land, the culture.
It does. And the source talks about the difference between a closed-minded tourist who just judges a culture based on their own prejudices and a wiser traveler. The wiser traveler tries to be open to these higher forces, and they can actually learn a lot from this.
So it's about being open-minded, receptive
Yeah.
when we encounter different cultures,
Exactly.
not judging based on our own limited perspective.
Right.
Okay, so we've talked about the influence of individuals, even the collective spirit of a race on a place. What about the influence of specific places themselves, like certain locations?
This is another layer of unseen influence, right? So certain places, because they've been exposed to specific thoughts and emotions over and over, well, they become kind of permeated by that energy.
Okay.
The collective mindset of the people who live there or visit there, it can actually affect others who come into contact with that place.
I'm thinking of like certain cities that just have a vibe. You go there and you just feel a certain energy.
Mm.
And the source gives an example of like seaside resorts.
Yeah, popular ones in England. They often have this atmosphere of, well, almost like buoyancy, irresponsibility, like a strong sense of holiday life.
Right.
And it can be hard to escape that. So even if you go there wanting peace and quiet, you might find yourself getting caught up in that energy.
Yeah, like the collective energy of the place overrides your personal intentions.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's get back to those nature spirits we were talking about earlier. The source talks about separate lines of evolution for humans and nature spirits.
Yeah. So right now, humans and nature spirits, they're on parallel but distinct paths.
Okay.
They both come from the same source, the solar deity, and they evolve together through those really early stages up to about the mineral level.
Okay.
But then their paths diverge.
Okay, so they're not just like less evolved humans.
Right. They're on their own journey with their own girls and experiences.
Okay, and the source even says that those land fairies, they don't just come from gnomes.
Yeah, not just the elementals of Earth.
Their lineage might even go back to, like, fungi and bacteria. That's wild.
Right. And then it can extend through insects, reptiles, birds, before they become what we recognize as fairies.
So it's like a whole other branch of the tree of life.
Yeah, with all these interconnected pathways we might not even be aware of.
Okay, so the source also talks about what happens to thought forms that are created by humans.
Yeah.
You know, those mental constructs that we make with our minds.
Right. So thought forms that are consciously created, they're ultimately temporary unless they have a connection to, well, to a real life stream, a soul. They're kind of like powered by the will of the person who created them. And without that, they eventually fade away.
So if we're not constantly feeding them with our attention and energy, they just kind of dissolve back into the ether.
Exactly. Like temporary mental constructs that serve a purpose and then they're gone.
Okay.
But then the source contrasts those thought forms with real nature spirits. These nature spirits, they're often described as looking like tiny hummingbirds, all iridescent quick, and they follow their own evolutionary path.
So they're not dependent on human thought or energy to exist.
Right, they're evolving on their own. Their journey starts in the plant kingdom with grasses and cereals. Then they move into the animal kingdom as ants and bees. And then they become these small nature spirits, etheric fairies.
Okay.
And then they evolve into salamanders, which are associated with fire, and sylphs associated with air.
Okay.
And eventually they even reach the angel kingdom. So it's a long journey.
It's like a whole other spiritual hierarchy, separate from humans, but evolving alongside us.
Yeah, exactly. And what's really interesting is that the source talks about different types of nature spirits being associated with different parts of the world.
Okay, so like different geographic locations have different kinds of nature spirits.
Right. Like in England, France, Belgium, and even parts of the US, you see these emerald green ones. In the Dakotas, there are black and white ones. California, white and gold. Australia has sky blue ones. And Java is supposed to be full of them, with indigo and yellow ones.
Wow, it's like each region has its own little nature spirit ecosystem.
It is. It's fascinating.
So what about like their general characteristics, besides the color variations?
Well, their bodies are described as being ethereal, meaning they don't have the same kind of solid structure that we do, so they can't be physically harmed in the same way.
Okay.
They can't be torn or cut, and temperatures don't affect them the same way. Salamanders are even said to love fire.
That makes sense. Fire spirits. Okay, so what else?
And nature spirits in general, they're really fast, and they can easily avoid unpleasant vibrations.
Okay.
And unlike animals, they don't seem to experience fear. It's like they're just freer.
Okay, so they exist in this kind of higher vibrational state, less weighed down by fear and the physical limitations of the material world. Okay, so let's bring the focus back to us humans and our own minds.
Okay.
The source talks about the power of mental images and thought forms. And this seems like a really important part of understanding our own influence on the unseen world.
Yeah, this is a big one. The source explains how those focused mental images, like the ones used in those Indian tricks or mentalism, they can create really strong thought forms. And those thought forms can actually manifest in the physical or astral realms.
So our thoughts aren't just, fleeting things in our heads. They have a real power to create.
Exactly. A mental image, it's not just a fantasy. It's an actual construction in mental matter.
Okay, so our thoughts have substance. They can actually shape reality.
Right. And the way our mind communicates with our physical brain, it's not direct. It goes through these astral and etheric layers.
Okay.
And those layers, well, that's where those energetic impressions can be introduced. That's how, mental suggestions, affirmations, they can have real effects.
Okay, so even just thinking positive thoughts, visualizing things, can actually have an impact.
Yeah, potentially. But it also means we need to be really careful about what we're thinking
Yeah.
because our thoughts are like seeds that we're planting in these unseen realms, and those seeds can grow.
So we have a responsibility to be mindful of our thoughts.
Exactly.
Okay. The source also mentions water spirits. What can you tell us about them?
Yeah, these water spirits, they're often called undines or nereids, and they're kind of similar to land fairies,
Okay.
especially those associated with rivers and waterfalls. The ocean ones are a bit different,
Okay.
but like the earth and air spirits, water spirits, they can change their shape. Often they appear in human form. Those sea spirits tend to be human-sized, while fairies are usually smaller. But the key thing is they can all change their size and shape whenever they want. Super fluid.
Okay, so they're very fluid, very adaptable, just like the element of water itself. Okay, so we've talked about thought forms and how they have a life of their own. But the source also talks about how these thought forms and emotions, both individually and collectively, can linger in specific places.
Right, and this can create a very real atmosphere.
Okay.
So strong emotions and thoughts, especially when they're repeated over and over, they can permeate a location. The source gives the example of like old cathedrals, centuries of prayers and devotional thoughts. They've created these powerful devotional thought forms that almost radiate from the walls.
You can feel that, right? You go into some of those old churches and it feels different.
It does. In contrast, the source also talks about like meeting houses for certain religious groups.
Okay.
They can have this atmosphere of criticism, judgment because of the thoughts and emotions of the people who gather there.
Okay, so places can hold on to those energies, the good and the bad.
Yeah, and we contribute to that with our own thoughts and emotions.
Okay, so the source has some interesting things to say about the gladiatorial combats in ancient Rome. Gives a bit of a different perspective.
Yeah, it points out that the gladiators were almost always condemned criminals.
Right.
So while it was definitely brutal, it wasn't necessarily worse than other forms of entertainment at the time.
Okay.
And for the criminals, fighting gave them a chance, however slim, of survival.
Okay, so it's a less romanticized, more pragmatic view of the whole thing.
Exactly. You got to consider the historical context.
Okay, so the source talks about certain cities that have these really strong historical energies.
Yeah, places where the past kind of overshadows the present, like those old towns in Holland on the Zuider Zee or S. Albans in England. But Rome, it's given as the best example because it's got these like 3 layers of psychic impressions.
3 layers.
Yeah. You've got the Rome of the Republic and the Caesars. Then there's medieval Rome with the church. And then modern Rome, still important, but not as grand as it once was.
Wow, so it's like walking through different layers of time. You can almost feel the energy of each era.
Yeah, if you're sensitive to it.
What about like places that are considered sacred, like certain mountains? Is that just human belief or is there more to it?
The source says that sometimes those sacred places, it's